Welcome to the Two World Podcast, where you can hear thoughts and reflections on unique intersections between faith and culture. Tune in regularly for this foray into feelings of surprise and interconnectedness and aha moments in life when two worlds come together. Now join your hosts, Barney and Jacob, for this most recent episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Two World Podcast. We are always thankful for you listening along with us and going on this journey of faith in multiple cultures as they find ways to connect across cultures, across languages, and of course across physical distance. As Jacob and I are making this episode, it is near the end of August of 2021. And as you may be aware, at the beginning of this month, August 6th marked 76 years since the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And as Jacob and I have both traveled to Hiroshima at two different times, we thought that today it would be appropriate if I spoke a little bit about my time in Hiroshima and see what connections that we can make between the city and the broader lessons of faith. Thinking about the Second World War and things that were happening in Japan, my wife actually has a connection with the firebombings that took place in Tokyo. They actually lasted for almost 3 full years. And her grandmother, her family grew up in Tokyo. And they had to flee the area, of course, as their home was burned down, and ended up where they are now in a very rural area in eastern Japan. And when I talk with my wife's grandma, she's just a wonderful woman in many ways, but occasionally if this topic comes up or something related to the war comes up where she is reminded of her old home, I can see and sense a real pain that she still has with her based on what happened and how her family had to flee the area and all of the things that they ended up leaving behind.
Thanks for sharing that, Barney. And I want to just invite our listeners today to hear these stories as maybe something additional to add to the narrative that they've received about World War II and the relationship between the United States and Japan. I know for me, coming to Japan to visit you, Barney, and some of these sites, I learned so much about a different aspect of the story, a different perspective, and it grieved me greatly. But I felt like it was important for me to enter into that place and that story and understand it and go away and share with others about it, that there's a certain responsibility to this history, particularly for us having grown up in the U.S. and recognizing that it was our ancestors who had made decisions in light of their circumstances to use nuclear weapons and certain strategy to end the war. But the human cost and the moral and the social cost for people living in Japan at the time was excruciating. And for us in the U.S., we haven't always been aware or been made aware of that. And so it's kind of in my view, like a moral responsibility for the current generation to learn that story and to live life differently in light of it and to try to be agents for peace. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can unpack a little bit more for us, your own journey learning more. You started already talking about Ayako and her family. What else would you like to say getting us started in your own journey with learning more about this?
Yeah, I wonder if maybe you yourself have had a similar experience. I think maybe other people, when they came to visit Japan, maybe for the first time, when I finally had the chance to, see Japanese people, meet Japanese people, growing up in the small community where I didn't really run into anyone from many other different cultures, and certainly not Japan. And it was hard to kind of connect what we learned in history with the people. And when I first came to Japan, I really felt a sense of guilt I felt a sense of, I have, somewhere, like you say, our ancestors, there is this kind of responsibility that I have connected in a way with what happened with the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then when we learn about the fire bombings in Tokyo, which I think is something that maybe we rarely get to in our history books, and to see that here are these wonderful people. Of course, maybe they have some connection to the war, maybe they don't, but personal connection to the war. But here are these wonderful people, and it's hard to understand and maybe separate, like you said, the decisions that were made at the time and then what is happening in my place in the present. I really personally felt strongly about that and felt a lot of pain as well about that too. And I really felt like I had to unburden myself, like I had to just share this to let the people know I'm really sorry. And I talked about this with Ayako a few times. Her reaction was so interesting because she just kind of shrugged her shoulders. She just thought, oh, yeah, it was just something that happened. Maybe not so lightly, but, I thought, here I'm trying to unburden myself and opening myself up to, say how deeply, deeply sorry I am about this. And her reaction was much, much softer, probably much more like it's something that maybe the Japanese people have already processed and made it through in a way that it's really part of their past. And really, a lot of things have changed since then as well. After the war, the emperor was no longer really a symbol of power, but just a figurehead. And they had a completely new constitution. And of course, just thinking now with the Olympics, it's amazing to think just maybe 20 years or 21 years after the bombing, they were hosting the 1964 Olympics. So I guess 19 years. And just that amount of progress, I think, and just the Japanese zeitgeist in general probably gives them such perspective that my feeling of this terrible, terrible tragedy that happened, and of course, they commemorate it and learn about it, it's processed on such a different level for people in Japan. And that was so interesting to learn for myself.
Wow, that is really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. It makes me think, when you want to enter in to learn another story from another culture, learn about the experience of people in another country, having the posture of following their lead is so important. Like, you heard Ayako and you saw what her response was, and so you didn't push further and say, no, really, wait, we need to talk through this. So you heard like where she was, and
Yeah.
it reminds me a little bit of when we were able to visit with Yachio Bible Baptist Church and for the Wednesday evening study. And I was talking with the pastor about my time in Hiroshima, and he said how when he had gone as a younger child, it was such a bad experience. Yeah. It was the emphasis back then was more on the horrors of what happened. And by the time that I had gone, years later, the messaging had shifted more to the resilience of the people in the city and the peace declaration and the hope of children in a new generation. And the special location where the children's art is displayed, messages of hope and seeking for a more peaceful world. And so I think when he heard that, and we were talking, it just seemed like there was, as you said, a sense in which the country as a whole has grown and moved on, and the situation has evolved, and now there's just a different emphasis. So maybe that impulse that you and I had to enter in with a deep apology, maybe for a different era earlier in the process, may have been more akin to what would have been sought. But now, after this process and healing and growth, it seems like, yeah, there's a different, just to learn and know the story and be present, seems like that's the appropriate posture, maybe.
Yeah. And of course, soon after the war, is when Protestant missionaries were first able to come into Japan. And there's one Baptist missionary, Lauren Roberts, who shares about his uncle, who I don't know that he was in Japan, but he fought in the war. And for that part of his life, he wasn't saved. And, even though the result of the war ended up favorably for America, this man at the time had nothing favorable to say about Japan at all. And just somehow something touched this man's heart as well. And he ended up being saved, and he ended up finding a real peace about what he went through, and ended up encouraging Lauren to go into missionary and into Japan. So like you're saying, through different points in time, we have these different lenses, and talking about the same subject, the closer we are to the subject, just same with Kimiaki Sensei's case, the narrative really changes. And thankfully, not the narrative, but the way that we look at the event now, we're able to see it in a much different light. And thankfully, the people in Japan are able to see that in a different way too.
Yes, it's interesting to consider the decision that individuals along the way made to be constructive and seek after change and transformation in the world, instead of doubling down on anger and bitterness and condemnation. Everybody would have understood that if they had stayed there because of how tragic it was. But I think it was just 2 years after the bombing that, at least in the city of Hiroshima, they had the city council had their first peace declaration. They had like a summit, and they were basically getting the message out there that early that we want to advocate for a more peaceful world. We want to advocate for nuclear non-proliferation and the ceasing of nuclear weapons and warfare, and we want to advocate for peacemaking. And it just so quickly that they made that decision really is inspiring to me. And today, all of the signs around the Peace Memorial, the Peace Park, the Hall of Remembrance, so many signs point to this, advocating for people to be drawn in to be part of this transformation of our world, an advocacy for peacemaking, and ringing the peace bell and letting it resound out as a message that we seek after together the end of nuclear weapons. And it's inspiring that the city would decide that course. And you talked about the new constitution. Even in the new constitution for Japan, having a pacifist element is interesting. Now, I know since then, in time evolves, maybe people revisit that and want changes due to their sense of regional threats. But it just from the aspect of the response and how the city has moved forward, it's very inspiring to me.
Yeah. Again, growing up in the U.S. in a small town, it's hard to have any real image of what Japan was really about, aside from Tokyo. When people ask me about my first impressions of Japan, I say, wow, I didn't realize there was so much nature. In somewhere in my mind, I thought it's like Coruscant. It's just this one giant country of city after city after city after city, right? And of course, I had no idea really what Hiroshima was about, aside from, just those few lines that you read in the textbook. But it was a very metropolitan city and had a thriving art scene going, and just was such an amazing place, I think. And talking about my trip there, it was very brief, but of course the thing that stood out to us most, of course, was the atomic bomb dome. That I believe it was a cultural center is what it was, and it was designed by a Czech architect. And he designed other buildings throughout Japan as well. So just to see this incorporation of outside, inviting architects from Europe, from around the world to take part in the construction of this city, really learning that put it really in a whole new light for me to see what the city had been and really what was lost as a result of choosing that city as one of the targets.
Yes, that's a really interesting point. And I wonder, there's a certain sense in which Japan might have been viewed as being closed off to the world, but
Mm-hmm.
what you're describing is a much more dynamic, complex relationship with other countries, and maybe greater diversity culturally and in terms of the connections back then than we would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of wondering about, you had mentioned before the missionary
Mm-hmm.
story. I know that there were some Christians already in
Yeah.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For example,
Mm-hmm.
there's a book that I learned about when I was working as assistant to chaplain at the College of Worcester called One Sunny Day, and it tells the story of Hideko Temura Snyder. She was at the time a young girl in 1945 in August when the bomb fell, and tragically her family was scheduled to go on a camping trip out of town, and she said, "Can we stay here just one more day?" And she lived with a deep sense of sorrow because that day that they were still there was when the bomb fell. And if only, she thought, if only we had just gone on that trip, we would have been away from the site and my parents would still be alive. But she came and spoke at the College of Worcester, and then I was able to go out to lunch with her afterwards.
Wow.
And to hear about her faith and the community, other people she knew in the city who were Christians, different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I hadn't really thought of it at the time, but looking at it later, there was definitely a cost to the faith community. One of my friends I was talking with once made this comment. Perhaps the reason why today Christianity doesn't have a larger presence in Japan, maybe one of the contributing factors was the dropping of these nuclear bombs. It was a terrible act from a Western nation. Christianity is often associated with Western nations, and also there was a loss of Christians and in these communities as well. A loss of all life, and anybody who died, it was tragic.
Yeah.
Looking at it from the lens of this idea of a tragedy also in relation to faith.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that dimension before. Could that have also contributed to the struggle, how to even view Christianity, for some?
Yeah, and especially with the history that Nagasaki has of being the port city for Portugal for so many years.
Right, the Portuguese missionaries, right.
Yeah.
Ah.
So even from the 1500s or around then, that was the one port that they were allowed to use, and the Dutch as well. It's just curious to choose that as a site when that also had a lot of Christian influence in that area.
Yes. Do you have anything more that you would like to say in relation to your journey when you visited, when you were actually at the location? What did any particular insight come that you hadn't had before walking through the space, or any new feeling or emotion that maybe you received when you were there?
Unfortunately, at that time, my main duty was tour guide for my parents. Yeah. And we were on a schedule because actually, I think the next day we were going to Kimiaki Sensei's hometown. But I do remember finally getting to see the site. I think that the way that we approached it there were I think buildings, maybe shopping centers or something kind of in the way, so in the way. And then we turned the corner and then we saw the building, the atomic bomb dome there. And as much of the centerpiece as that is, I remember being most impacted when we were walking around, and I think we went down a little slope in that area where I think it was a decoration of 1,000 paper cranes, I believe, stitched together. And I think that maybe, if I can remember correctly, I think it's different elementary schools maybe that make them either in the area or maybe throughout Japan. And then they display them, because talking about fragility, they're made out of paper. They only last so long. And then their commitment to renewing this symbol of the 1,000 paper cranes. And I guess it's more connected with the radiation sickness and health after tragedy or in the midst of illness. And I thought that, first of all, it takes a long time and you get good at it, but it takes a while to get these cranes folded. And when you're folding them, some don't quite turn out the way you want and some don't quite look right. And all of these looked perfect. And the way that they arranged the colors together was just beautiful. And I could see that the children who made them were probably really, they weren't thinking, this is something that I have to do for this project. But in my mind, they were really dedicated and committed to being a part of this witness for peace and for healing that they wanted to eventually send down to Hiroshima to be displayed. And maybe if they're in a school that's in the northern part of Japan, maybe they wouldn't even see it while it's being displayed. That kind of connection with the pacifist constitution, and they've had all of this time that they could have changed it, and they were close a few years ago, but the people of Japan want to have this as a symbol, many different symbols in their country of advocating for peace. And then seeing this, I guess, installment of these paper cranes and how beautiful they were and well done, but also how fragile they are. Just if a little bit of rain or too much humidity in the morning, and they start to deteriorate and they need to be replaced. But it's kind of a microcosm of the commitment to peace that a lot of people have, and that whole area really represents.
That's powerful. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because the paper cranes had an impact on me too. I saw it from a slightly different angle, because part of the Peace Park and the museum, particularly in the museum, that is really emphasized are personal stories and testimonies of survivors or those affected by the event. And some of the most gripping parts of going through were just hearing those stories and listening and thinking. And one of them was about this young girl, Sadiko Sazaki, who developed leukemia after the bombing. And yes, the paper cranes were connected with her story, that she believed potentially if she could fold 1,000 paper cranes, that a wish would be granted to her and she would be healed of her leukemia. And she ended up folding, I think, 1,300 before she died. I think that was part of what sparked that symbolism. Hearing that story and how people picked it up and continue to this day to honor her memory, and doing that is powerful. Other testimonies too that highlighted the loss, but then the seeking of hope and healing afterwards. For me, a really powerful place was the Hall of Remembrance, which is a room that has a panorama of the drop zone of the bomb right after the bombing. And so it depicts the neighborhoods based off of photographs they have from the time after the bombing in a panoramic fashion. You stand in the middle. If you turn around, you can see all of this destruction, but the emphasis there is not to just leave you there in a sense of loss. They want you to go and you have time to just sit or to stand in quiet in that space and think about and pray and lift up what had happened. But then they have a space outside of that room for journaling, and you can see what others have felt when they were there, all types of different messages. You can leave your own. And then they have more testimonies. You can watch videos right in an adjacent room, people's stories. And the feeling that you get coming away from it is that you have had space to honor and mourn, but you've also had space to get a renewed sense of hope and commitment to peace. And so that was a very powerful part of visiting, I would say, for me.
Yeah, and maybe as just kind of a way to wrap up, as my time there was as a tour guide, for my parents, you can see a lot of the different things in Japan that are just unique to Hiroshima. One of the things I like best about traveling is eating, and they have their own style of okonomiyaki. Some people translate it as a savory pancake, with cabbage and noodles and egg and pork. And my parents just love that. And then in the bay, in the area, lots of oysters are prevalent. And we had that as well. And it's just hard to imagine, when you think about what happened in the past and then the stages that the city has gone through since then. It's very reassuring. And I love what you mentioned about them so quickly making a dedication to peace. And I think in that dedication of peace, they're also saying that they're making a dedication to forgiveness, because how could you have peace without forgiveness? And I wonder if maybe that's one of the biggest messages that that city right now is standing as a symbol toward. And yeah, just hopefully more and more people will have the chance to visit and will see and be inspired by the city, and hopefully see and be inspired by a connection of peace and forgiveness as well, I think.
That's well said, Barney. What a meaningful and helpful conversation this is to have with you, and so grateful for this, and for all who are listening to that you've taken time to consider this. And just want to encourage you all to continue to grow and learn more about this story, about this message of forgiveness and resilience and hope embodied by cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And want to thank you for listening today and entering into this time.